He's insane. He's clinically insane.
He might be,
Oh, yes.
because he can't turn it off,
He
right?
can't turn it off. He doesn't know who turned it on.
For decades, Morrissey has never shied away from saying exactly what's on his mind. Revered by fans as a lyrical genius and reviled by critics as polarizing, his opinions have ignited admiration, outrage, and endless debate. But behind the poetic melancholy and political controversy lies a more personal list, a list of artists who crossed him, clashed with him, or simply didn't meet his standards. Morrissey, true to form, has never held back. From pop legends to fellow punk icons, these are the 7 musicians Morrissey openly disliked, and the reasons behind those tensions may shock even his most loyal fans. Of all the musicians Morrissey has openly criticized, few rival the intensity of his disdain for Madonna, a pop icon whose fame, fortune, and global adoration seem to represent everything he finds wrong with the music industry. While the average listener might see 2 musical greats from different worlds, he, the melancholic voice of alienation, she, the queen of reinvention, Morrissey has, for decades, taken shots at Madonna with a venom that feels deeply personal. To him, she is the embodiment of manufactured fame, commercial exploitation, and artistic soullessness. He once remarked, with scorn, that Madonna was the closest thing America has to a war criminal, a deliberately provocative statement that blurred satire with disgust. But beneath the hyperbole lies Morrissey's core belief that pop should have substance, not just spectacle. He saw in Madonna a calculated performer more obsessed with shock value and dollar signs than emotional truth or cultural rebellion. At a time when Madonna was pushing boundaries with her sexuality, image, and branding, Morrissey recoiled, not out of prudishness, but because he viewed her provocations as empty gestures wrapped in corporate packaging. To Morrissey, the artist should be vulnerable, poetic, and principled. Madonna, in his eyes, was an entertainer without conscience, someone who appropriated rebellion for profit without understanding its roots. He was particularly incensed by her use of fur in fashion and called her a fur hag, amplifying his disdain through his long-standing activism for animal rights. The rift wasn't just artistic, it was ideological. While Madonna climbed stages draped in couture and controversy, Morrissey used his platform to confront the monarchy, the meat industry, and consumerism. Their visions of what music should be, what a musician should stand for, could not have been further apart. And yet, their paths continued to intersect, particularly in the press, where fans often compared their lasting cultural impacts. Morrissey hated this comparison. He believed that while he stood for unpopular truths, Madonna pandered to trends. He once said, "She's not art, she's just a product, a Barbie doll with a record deal." For someone who spent his life fighting against being boxed in, categorized, or controlled, Madonna represented the final boss of commodified culture, a human brand masquerading as a musician. And yet, what makes Morrissey's hatred more fascinating is that it's laced with something deeper than just distaste. There's almost a tragic undertone to it, as if he mourns the space artists like Madonna occupy. Space that, in his view, could have been filled by those with real poetic soul. He didn't just dislike her. He saw her as a symbol of the machine that had chewed up and spit out a generation of true artists. Madonna, of course, never responded in kind. Perhaps she found his criticism irrelevant or simply knew better than to fuel his fire. But Morrissey never needed a sparring partner to make his point. His critiques were not just about Madonna herself, but about what she represented, a society more in love with glamour than meaning, with trends than truth. And while many dismissed his comments as bitter or outdated, others recognized the validity. In his protest, a protest not against one woman, but against a cultural direction that left him, and so many like him, behind. As Morrissey once mused in an interview, "She'll always have the charts, but I'll always have the scars." It was one of those rare admissions where the wounded poet peeked through the armor, acknowledging that behind the disdain may lie disappointment, not just in Madonna, but in a world that celebrates the very thing he spent his life resisting. When Morrissey turned his ire toward Elton John, it wasn't subtle, and it certainly wasn't a passing comment. It was a full-throated, long-standing, ideologically charged denunciation of a man Morrissey saw as the antithesis of everything he believed a true artist should be. In Morrissey's mind, Elton John didn't just represent the glitzy, overproduced era of stadium pop rock. He was the poster child for it. A musician who, despite undeniable talent, chose commercial safety over artistic rebellion, and who, in Morrissey's estimation, abandoned any shred of authenticity the moment he traded raw piano ballads for diamond-encrusted spectacles and royal gala performances. Morrissey once scoffed, "Elton John is proof that you can have every award in the world and still be completely hollow." And while some laughed, others recognized that Morrissey wasn't merely throwing barbs. He was building a philosophical case. What especially galled him was Elton's apparent coziness with the British monarchy, an institution Morrissey has vocally detested for decades. Elton's knighthood, his regular appearances at royal events, and his tabloid friendship with the late Princess Diana only further distanced him from Morrissey's world, a world built on anti-establishment poetry, rejection of celebrity worship, and a deep mistrust of state-sanctioned honor. Morrissey once ranted on stage about artists who bow to kings, suggesting that doing so disqualifies any claim to rebellion or authenticity. He didn't need to name names. Everyone knew who he meant. The clash became even more personal when Elton criticized Morrissey's outspoken views on vegetarianism and animal rights. Elton, who performed at high-profile hunting club events and maintained relationships with figures from industries Morrissey viewed as exploitative, became a lightning rod for everything Morrissey despised. In response, Morrissey accused Elton of hypocrisy and cowardice, saying, "He sings about love while endorsing bloodshed," a reference to both animal cruelty and the political causes Elton supported that Morrissey believed were morally bankrupt. But it didn't stop there. Morrissey also targeted Elton's public persona, his embrace of celebrity culture, his lavish lifestyle, and his tendency to appear everywhere from American Idol to royal weddings. In Morrissey's world, fame should be earned by truth-telling, not by clapping along to the rhythm of cultural expectations. Elton's omnipresence was a symbol to Morrissey of how art had become entertainment and how rebellion had been traded for royalty. He called Elton a karaoke king in a feather boa, a devastating dig that underscored his view that the man who once gave us "Your Song" had long since lost the plot. And yet, for all the vitriol, there's an unmistakable pain in Morrissey's words. As if Elton's career path didn't just disappoint him, it betrayed something deeper. The idea that someone with such immense talent could choose pomp over purpose, applause over impact. Morrissey, always the wounded idealist, seems unable to forgive Elton for what he views as the worst crime of all, squandering the platform of art in favor of comfort and conformity. Critics, of course, accused Morrissey of jealousy, of generational bitterness, of sniping at those who reached levels of fame he never did. But Morrissey would argue he never wanted that kind of fame. To him, Elton's knighthood wasn't a trophy. It was a leash. His arena tours weren't victories. They were symptoms of creative decay. Even Elton's philanthropy was, to Morrissey, tainted by proximity to the very institutions Morrissey viewed as morally corrupt. And while Elton rarely responded directly, he did once remark in an interview that Morrissey was too angry to be taken seriously, brushing off the criticism as the ramblings of a man stuck in a past that no longer existed. But Morrissey would counter that it's precisely that anger which makes him serious. That rage is the last refuge of sincerity in an industry rotted by branding and ego. The feud, though one-sided in its volume, reveals a deeper philosophical divide. Elton John represents the mainstream made palatable, the rebellious youth turned royal guest. Morrissey, the poet who refused to grow palatable, choosing instead to alienate, provoke, and unsettle until the end. It's not just dislike, it's a spiritual rejection. Morrissey believes in music as moral confrontation. Elton John, in his Eyes, sings lullabies to a system that shouldn't be sleeping peacefully. If you're finding this deeper look into Morrissey's unfiltered truths compelling, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment with your thoughts below. Which artists do you think he unfairly judged or rightfully exposed? Few feuds in alternative music history have captured the imagination like the long-running animosity between Morrissey and Robert Smith, frontman of The Cure. On the surface, the rivalry seemed ironic. Two introverted, black-clad icons with cult followings, both emerging from the gloomy heart of 1980s post-punk Britain. But beneath the eyeliner and melancholy lyrics, there was a deep philosophical and personal rift that turned their shared genre into a battleground of egos, ideals, and venomous one-liners. The origins of their clash trace back to press interviews in the early 80s, when both bands were at the height of their cultural influence. Morrissey, with the Smiths, had positioned himself as the voice of literate, wounded youth, a defiant romantic, wielding words like daggers against authority, cruelty, and emotional dishonesty. Robert Smith, meanwhile, navigated his own brand of darkness, more atmospheric, less confrontational, and steeped in dreamy despair. To fans, both were prophets of pain, but to Morrissey, Robert Smith represented everything he despised about what his movement was becoming: self-indulgent, passive, and, worst of all, inauthentic. Morrissey's famous early insult, declaring that he'd rather eat his own testicles than join The Cure, wasn't just a joke. It was a shot across the bow. He viewed Smith as mopey for sport, someone who performed sadness rather than lived it. For Morrissey, whose misery had roots in alienation, identity, and class struggle, Smith's theatrical gloom was offensive, like a Halloween costume of the real thing. Smith, never one to back down, fired back with dry sarcasm, calling Morrissey a whinging git, and suggesting that he only courted controversy to sell records. The war of words escalated as their respective fan bases took sides, turning minor jabs into cultural lore. But at its core, the feud was about credibility. Morrissey believed his sorrow came with moral urgency. Smith's was, in his view, style, without substance. The contrast in their politics also stoked the fire. While Morrissey stood on militant platforms, criticizing monarchy, meat, and mediocrity, Robert Smith kept his activism quiet, preferring ambiguity to confrontation. This enraged Morrissey, who accused Smith of cowardice, of hiding behind artifice rather than confronting the world with conviction. Their beef lingered for decades, outliving most musical rivalries of the era. Morrissey never let go of the idea that Robert Smith represented a betrayal of what post-punk could have been: raw, righteous, and radical. Instead, he saw The Cure's success as proof that commercial viability came at the cost of urgency. He scoffed at their arena shows, their makeup, their ethereal ballads, accusing Smith of turning alienation into a carnival. What made the feud more fascinating was its occasional thaw. In a rare moment of reflection, Smith once admitted that, if they'd met under different circumstances, maybe they'd have been friends. Morrissey, for his part, once called disintegration not entirely awful, a backhanded compliment that almost sounded like peace. But those moments were fleeting. The underlying tension, the sense that each believed the other had polluted the waters of their shared genre, never truly vanished. Even decades later, the feud pops up in interviews, like a ghost neither can quite exorcise. Morrissey maintains that he's the last bastion of lyrical integrity in a world of posturing. To him, Robert Smith will always be the mirror image, a man playing the part of the outcast without ever paying the price. In truth, both men have paid dearly for their art, and perhaps that's why the feud has endured, because it reflects a deeper fear in both artists, that in each other they see a distorted version of themselves. Two outsiders, desperate to be understood, lashing out across time not just at each other but at the very systems that failed them both. As the list of Morrissey's most disliked musicians continues, it becomes clear that his critiques aren't limited to the obvious pop targets or ideological opposites. Sometimes his most scathing comments are reserved for those closest to his world, those he admired once, or those he feels betrayed by. Few names reveal this complexity more than David Bowie, an artist Morrissey once idolized, collaborated with, and then, as with many of his heroes, publicly distanced himself from with biting precision. Their relationship began with admiration. Morrissey credited Bowie as a vital influence, even inviting him to share the stage during a tour. But things soured over time, and when Bowie allegedly dropped Morrissey from a supporting slot without explanation, the bitterness turned public. Morrissey labeled him a businessman in drag, a calculated performer who had long since abandoned sincerity for strategy. It was a heartbreak masked as a takedown, proof that for Morrissey, disappointment always cuts deeper when it comes from someone he once respected. Then there's George Michael, whom Morrissey once ridiculed as the singer of the lavatory, a crude dismissal that stemmed from Morrissey's belief that Michael's music lacked intellectual depth. Morrissey despised the way Michael leaned into sensuality and commercialism, seeing him as another artist shaped not by conviction, but by audience expectations. To Morrissey, George Michael's vulnerability seemed selective, only palatable once it was softened by fame. The same disdain extended to figures like Bono of U2, who Morrissey accused of charity as performance, mocking his brand of activism as self-serving and hypocritical. He wears his causes like a designer suit, Morrissey once said, suggesting that for all of Bono's humanitarian efforts, there was an air of calculated self-promotion. Even Bob Geldof wasn't spared. Morrissey called Live Aid the most self-righteous platform for sanctimonious pop stars, dismissing the entire event as an exercise in Western vanity. It's clear that Morrissey's problem isn't always with the music. It's with the perceived motives behind it. He demands purity from artists, and when they fail to meet his impossible standards, he writes them off entirely. But his criticisms don't stop at icons. Former Smith's bandmates, especially drummer Mike Joyce and bassist Andy Rourke, have also been targets of his disdain, especially after a lengthy legal battle over royalties. Morrissey accused Joyce of betrayal, painting him as someone who profited off the Smiths' legacy without contributing meaningfully to its essence. He once referred to the courtroom drama as the ultimate knife in the back, a wound that clearly never healed. Even Johnny Marr, once his closest collaborator and creative twin, hasn't been immune to the passive-aggressive tone Morrissey adopts when discussing old alliances. Though their public exchanges have been more restrained than with others, the tension between the two is evident, a cold war of competing legacies. Through all these feuds, one theme becomes unmistakable. Morrissey sees music as sacred, and anyone who treats it like a business, a brand, or a marketing tool becomes a target. He despises not just superficiality, but the betrayal of authenticity. And because the music industry is built on compromise, almost everyone becomes guilty in his eyes. It's a lonely perch he occupies, one that requires alienating collaborators, burning bridges, and maintaining a moral rigidity that leaves little room for reconciliation. Yet there's a strange kind of integrity to it, a stubborn refusal to play along with a system he considers broken. Whether he's taking down Madonna, Bowie, Bono, or his own bandmates, Morrissey speaks with the fury of someone who once believed in music as salvation and now sees only shadows. He may be bitter, he may be controversial, but he's never insincere. And that, in the end, is perhaps what makes his dislikes so compelling. Not because they are always fair, but because they are rooted in a worldview that refuses to compromise, even when it costs him everything.